You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And we will be doing politics, but also a lot of public policy this evening, because we have as our guest Laurence Msall. He is the president of the Civic Federation, one of the major, perhaps the major business group in downtown Chicago. He's been in this business. We'll talk about what this business is as we get into that show, but he's been in this business for about 3 decades. He knows a lot, and so we're not going to do any more. We'll come back to tell the audience more about you, Mr. Msall, as we get into it, but just pretend I'm Bruce Rauner. I know he's a little taller, better looking, but pretend I am.
Looks like you have the same watch.
Same watch, right? We both had it for the last 40 years. Okay, and I am Bruce Rauner. We're taping this on January 7th, but it'll be airing in January 19th or 26th, or at least that week in Chicago and Rockford and Aurora and the Chicago metro suburbs. So when it airs, the governor will be Bruce Rauner. So I'm Bruce Rauner. What should I do? I'm asking Laurence Msall, president of the Civic Federation.
So Governor-elect Rauner is right now putting together not only his new cabinet, but all the essential people to advise him. So he's looking for the best and the brightest. That's what every governor tries to do, to make sure when you take on the responsibilities of running as complex and as difficult a state as Illinois, that you have the best people possible around you. That's what Mr. Rauner's job number one is right now. Unfortunately, while he's putting his team together, the state of Illinois' financial situation is deteriorating. The state of Illinois passed a budget last May that Governor Quinn signed into law that they knowingly used gimmicks, accounting gimmicks, to increase spending beyond which they have available revenue. Illinois, which has the worst rated credit of any major or of any state in the United States, is actually slipping behind. They had a temporary income tax increase that expired on January 1st, so now they're seeing a significant reduction in available revenue. But the budget that they're operating under did not put reserves in place so that they could absorb that reduction in revenue. They used accounting gimmicks and borrowing from existing state funds resources so that they would maintain spending. So on day one, when Governor-elect Rauner becomes Governor Rauner, he will be facing an enormously difficult financial situation.
Okay, and let's be specific. When he becomes governor, he'll be dealing with the last half of fiscal 2015 budget, right?
Correct.
So the governor, the legislature, they set the 2015 budget. Mr. Rauner's working with the last half of that, from January to June of 2015. That budget, the General Revenue Fund, was approximately how much for revenue? What were they projecting in that budget?
It was approximately $35 billion.
$35 billion, because only half of this tax change that you talked about has kicked in for this,
correct,
this half of the year. So $35 billion, and spending was what in that budget approximately?
Well, basically, it depends, because Illinois has a very opaque and not very easy to understand budgeting process. The state constitution requires you to have a balanced budget, but the state of Illinois is able to use accounting gimmicks that avoid balancing the budget by limiting your expenditures. One of the things that the state legislature did and the governor signed into law was to borrow from existing funds that have to be repaid in 18 months. So by borrowing for your operating expenses, by underestimating, according to Governor Quinn's office and Governor Quinn, when he signed the bill, there's approximately $500 million in known expenses, including personnel expenses, that are baked into the 2015 budget for which they don't have adequate revenue, for which they don't have adequate appropriation.
So you're saying there's at least a shortfall over the next 6 months of revenue relative to expenses of $500 million, $500
at
million.
Least.
At least.
That's by Governor Quinn's estimate. Once Governor-elect Rauner is in office and gets to see the actual spending, there's been a surge in spending in the last couple of months. There will be more detailed financial information available to Governor Rauner when he takes office. It's probably much higher.
All right. So a conservative estimate, the shortfall is probably $500 million to $2 billion for that 6 months, right?
It could easily be $2 billion.
Okay. And then, going right ahead, for the budget that Mr. Rauner will articulate, probably in February, maybe in March, depending on whether they modify that, but he will articulate the budget for fiscal 2016, which will cover an entire year from June 30, 2015 to June 30, 2016, an entire year with this new lower tax rate, unless somebody does something to change the tax rate. And if nobody does something to change the tax rate, Mr. Msall, what will the budget deficit be, or before the gimmicks?
Well, the budget pressures will be enormous. So this year, in 2015, we saw a drop of about $1.7 billion in state revenue with the expiration of the temporary income tax increase, dropping down to 3.75%. Over a full year, it will be well over $3 billion in terms of lost revenue. It's not dollar for dollar because there will be revenue growth. There will be, because there is economic activity going on, not as much as we'd like to see, not as much as most people would like to see in terms of employment opportunities, but state revenues tend to increase.
So he's probably dealing with, as of now, a $3 to $4 billion shortfall for that full 2016 budget.
Right, and that's probably a very conservative estimate for what his structural budget deficit will be.
So let's take the next 6 months. Let's take the next month. Should Mr. Rauner be looking to increase the state income tax rate, which has now gone for individuals to 3.75%? It went down from 5% at the beginning of the year because that happened statutorily, as you pointed out. And the corporate tax rate, I believe, dropped from 7% to 5.25%. Should Mr. Rauner move to increase either of those rates?
He can't address revenue issues in the abstract. He can't address the tax rate in the abstract. It has to be part of a comprehensive plan. What is the goal in terms of what you're going to achieve? What would the new revenue be used for? Really one of the disappointments of the temporary income tax increase for many people, it was promised that it was going to be used to stabilize the state finances, to pay down unpaid bills, to adequately fund the pensions. In reality, all of the money that came from the temporary income tax increase, that huge surge of revenue, only was enough to keep up with that year's pension contribution. And so because of pensions and pension-related debt that the state of Illinois has taken on, more and more the state budget goes into pensions. Currently, it's approximately 25% of every dollar of state revenue goes into the pension system. The state Supreme Court is going to rule this spring, hopefully, on the constitutionality of the pension changes that were made a year ago in December to the Illinois pension system. If the court upholds those changes, Mr. Rauner will see a reduction this year of $1 billion in the cost of maintaining the state pension system. If they find it unconstitutional, then he's going to have to come up with a plan for what do we do with a state that can't afford its pensions, that owes over $105 billion in unfunded pension liabilities to its employees and retirees. That is an enormous deficit that it has to make up.
Okay, so when you said, I guess your answer to my question was he has to do a comprehensive solution.
Right.
You can't just say lower or increase tax rates. You can't just say lower or increase spending. Can't just say ignore pensions. He's got a sort of multivariable, simultaneous equation problem to solve.
Right.
Let's try to focus this a little bit for some of our viewers who know a little less than you know about this. And so if they were wondering, if the budget was the general revenue budget for Illinois was $37 billion, and with tax rates going down, if nothing's done, moves toward $32 billion, if that's the case, what are the main drivers of that $32 billion or $37 billion? Some would say they are pensions, they are Medicaid, and they are education. Would you say those three things, pensions, Medicaid, education, account for what, 75% of the GRF budget?
A very large part.
Very
definitely.
large part.
Another large part is debt in the state's needing to borrow as well as to pay the debt service on previous borrowing. So
what is that? $1 billion, $2 billion, something like
well
that?
over
The debt
$1
service,
billion. Right?
Well over $1 billion.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that is something that is important for Mr. Rauner when he goes in, because as I mentioned, the state of Illinois is dangerously close to being non-investment grade in terms of the what the bond houses say is the credit rating of the state. If the state's credit rating continues to deteriorate, the cost of borrowing will continue to grow. Its ability to access the credit markets, which it needs to do, not just for infrastructure, but for general operating to make up for lags in revenue, if it loses the ability to access the credit markets at a reasonable price, all costs of government skyrocket.
Okay. So Rauner, I'm Mr. Rauner, and I'm sitting here and I'm trying to absorb what you've told me, and you've told me think a little bit about everything. But if we want to focus on some of this, Think a little bit about tax rates, because that will generate more or less revenue depending on what you do with that, whether it's the individual income tax rate, whether it's the corporate tax rate, whether it's the sales tax rate, which Mr. Rauner said he wanted to expand his services. Think a little bit, Mr. Rauner, about whether you can make Medicaid more efficient. Think about whether you can make education more efficient, whether you can somehow deal with this pension issue, whatever that means. And so does the Civic Federation of the organization you represent, do they have a position? Would they be telling Mr. Rauner something about all of those things I just told him to think about?
Right. The number one priority from the Civic Federation standpoint is the state budget. It's the highest priority. The state's instability, financial instability, and its worst rated credit of any state has an enormously negative impact on economic development, on the educational systems, on our school districts, on the attractiveness of the state of Illinois, and individually on our local governments.
What was it that had a negative impact on all
the
those?
state's financial instability,
Okay.
the failure to have a balanced budget, the failure to have a long-term financial plan that businesses and citizens can say, well, we see the state of Illinois is going forward. What's the tax rate going to be going forward? What can I predict in terms of if I make an investment in the state of Illinois, when will I get a return on that investment? When can I expect that? That is the number one issue facing the state.
Let's assume for a second that the Supreme Court, the Illinois Supreme Court, upholds that lower court decision, holds that the pension reform bill passed last year, signed by the governor, is unconstitutional. Let's assume they say that, and assume they don't give any guidance as to what they need to do, other than they make it clear the legislature can't do, if it wants to stay within the Constitution, which it may, what it did. So assume that happens. Does the Civic Federation have any suggestions as to what Mr. Rauner should do in that case with respect to pensions? So what does the Civic Federation recommend Mr. Rauner do in the eventuality of that Supreme Court ruling?
Then we would have to change the state constitution.
Amend the state constitution to allow
to go to the original intent,
Okay.
which was not to say that paramount for
Okay.
state government was to fund the pension system, but the promise of making the pension benefit a contractual right is something that has to be balanced against the basic interest of the state.
And that would
the
be
purpose of the state of Illinois is to provide the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of Illinois. That also is in the Constitution, which is why there is potentially a weighing of how you do that.
And that would be within the power of the legislature and the people to amend the Constitution, but it would take at least 2 years, right?
Potentially would take, depending on, and
At
how
least
soon
2
you could
years.
get it on the ballot.
Right.
Right. The problem is you don't have 2 years.
So,
The state's
so
financial situation
what does
doesn't let.
Mr. Rauner do in the next 2 years with regard to pensions? Anything?
There is no one who is
According to the Civic Federation.
According to the Civic Federation, according to any organization, there is no one who has articulated a plan for where the state would get the resources to maintain this $105 billion unfunded liability if you can't reduce it to some
Let's
level.
move on. Assuming that assumption is there and it's not quite resolved, let's turn to Medicaid. We only have a minute or so. It's a $15 billion program, counting what the feds give us. It's probably an $8 billion program in cost to Illinois, something like that. Is there anything he can do to reduce the rate of growth even of that program, according to the Civic Federation?
Well, it depends what areas of the Medicaid program. The state had very significant Medicaid reform 2 years ago, where over $1 billion was cut out of the Medicaid program. That was considerable sacrifice.
Right.
People, low-income people who had previously had access to dentists and to other services no longer have them because of those changes. That's a very expensive program, both to run, but all healthcare is expensive to run. There are things with the state employees, right? The mayor-elect or Mayor Emanuel has basically moved his retirees, his city retirees, onto the federal exchanges, or he's in the process of moving them there, for a great savings to the city of Chicago. There's more that the state of Illinois could do to manage its health care program. Its retiree health care program is one of the most generous in the country. Many times employees with 20 years of service pay nothing for their their retirement health insurance, and they have the option wherever they are to go to whatever hospital and whatever doctor they want with very little cost to
And
them.
according to the Supreme Court, can that be changed? Can the state start charging for those things and stay within the Constitution?
The Supreme Court hasn't ruled on what kind of changes you could make. They only ruled on the Canerva case, which was that was covered by the non-diminishment
So he
clause.
should certainly take a look at that.
He certainly has to continue to look at that, both for his existing employees and retirees. In the area generally of Medicaid, always you have to have an effort to reduce fraud and abuse. There's significant allegations always that people are being certified, but we delve in at the Civic Federation to the operations of the Medicaid program and the department that administers it. We've seen a lot of improvement.
So we've covered Medicaid, we've covered pensions, now we go to education. Is it time for the state to say, despite what Mr. Rauner said about we have to spend more on education, that's one area where maybe we could spend less because, you know, he's a believer in school choice. He's a believer in charter schools, school vouchers. We spend in Chicago $15,000 per kid per year in the Chicago public schools, and we get terrible results. We've had like 20 to 25% of the Hispanic black kids in fourth grade read at grade level. 75% we're sort of failing on. Is it time for him to say, one, by having more charter schools, more choice, encouraging that. I know he can't control all of that. Encouraging school vouchers so parents, if they want to, could take their $15,000 if they're dissatisfied and spend it at the charter school of their choice, the parochial school of their choice, if that's constitutional, the other private non-sectarian school. Some would say you could cut the cost down to maybe 11 in Chicago and other areas, proportionally, commensurately, from $15,000 to $11,000 and improve the quality. So you would do both, improve the quality, lower the cost, because as you believe, your members are mostly companies, large companies, businesses. They believe in competition. If we bring in competition into education, and I know it's a hard question to answer in a minute or two, but that's all we have. If we bring competition and choice into education, I think Rauner would say, Governor Rauner, lower costs, improve quality. What does the Civic Federation say?
The Civic Federation has long been a supporter of charter schools and the charter school movement. Those are public schools, but what they are the opportunity to provide a laboratory for taking off all of the restrictions of state statute, all of the restrictions of labor requirements, so you can actually focus on the core deliverables of education. But they're not a panacea. They're just a part of the public school system. You also have to identify how much of the state budget goes into the city or state employees, state teachers' employment retirement, right? So if you're going to fund education but the largest portion of that funding goes into the retirement system, is that achieving the goals that everyone has, which is to provide more resources to the classroom? Pension reform, it sounds sometimes like a broken record, but it's driving everything that goes on in the state of Illinois. There's not enough new money for education because we have so many obligations that we didn't fund for many years related to pensions. In terms of support for a voucher program, you have to basically say, where do you get the money to provide that voucher program when the city of Chicago this year, the Chicago Public Schools, are estimated to have a $1 billion budget deficit. If you can take the money from the public schools and put it on each student so that then they have the choice. They already have the choice for charter schools. Those are public schools. Those are funded by the government.
But you know there's a cap by the state legislature on the number of schools. There are only about 50,000 of the 400,000 CPS students who go to charter schools. That number, despite the support of Mayor Rahm Emanuel, is not much higher now than when he came in. If Mr. Rauner were to say, think of ways to have the state legislature encourage CPS and other areas in the state to increase the availability of charter schools to maybe 100,000 or 150,000 students, because as you know now, as you say, it's a public school, and if more people want to get into any specific charter school than there are slots, they have a lottery and the others are turned away. So rather than turning them away, say, here's another 50,000 slots. Now, we'll leave it to others to create.
Well,
you
it's
folks
not a
has
little
to
thing to leave to everybody else.
But we don't have
you're
time. We don't have time to
double
cover
the
that.
number of charter school
if you
providers.
will come back
That's a very
next week,
small.
we'll have you on and we'll devote the whole show to that.
Charter schools is something that
time.
Civic Federation supports. It's not something that we focus on entirely.
So we come to the major issue, which we skirted at the beginning of the show. We've talked about the spending side. We've done as much, I think, as we can humanly do in 27 minutes or so. Now we come to the revenue side, the tax side. Give Mr. Rauner, remember I started the show that way, give me some advice. John Tillman at the Illinois Policy Institute, and folks, Mr. Tillman says, don't raise the tax rate. And very briefly, he said on this show, don't raise the income tax rate, don't raise the corporate tax rate, I think he would say as well. because you want people to come here. You want businesses to come here. And he says the legislature said this was temporary. Keep that temporary, that increase. They will believe you. They will generate more revenue. And even though the rate is lower, you'll have more business, more economic activity, and so forth. For the next 6 months, should Mr. Rauner give that a try, or does he have to increase the individual income tax rate from 3.75%?
There's a couple of things. One, if you want to attract businesses, you want to attract people to the state of Illinois, the most corrosive economic development issue that we have in Illinois is uncertainty. If we don't know where the state is going from a financial standpoint, if we don't know what the tax rate's going to be from one year to the next, or if they're going to continue an income tax rate or a sales tax rate, that is exactly the opposite necessary to attract business. There's national studies that say policy uncertainty, tax policy uncertainty drives economic
how would you
attraction.
How would you
away.
increase certainty?
So
for
there's
business?
if you want to look at revenue, the state has a lot of expensive exemptions in its revenue code. You don't have to change the rate, but you could look at retirement income. Illinois is the only state in the Midwest that exempts all retirement income regardless of the source. The federal government taxes your retirement income. Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, they all tax some portion.
How much revenue does that
could
give
be
you?
billions. It could be over $1 billion, even if you exempt Social Security income.
So exempting Social Security, you're saying in the next 12-month period, you could get over $1 billion.
You could get over $1 billion.
That's $1 billion. Where else would you go? Anywhere
you could look
else?
at Mr. Rauner's idea of expanding the base on services to sales tax. You could look at some of the exemptions of the sales tax.
And what would you get
Food
there?
and drug, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars.
$600 or $700 million?
It does. It depends how far you want to go. But again, we don't look at the Civic Federation. You have to tell me how much revenue you need to raise.
Well, hypothetically, let me do that. I'm Mr. Rauner. Say I've decided I'm not going to raise the tax rate, and I'm going to cut spending and do some of these things you've suggested, maybe taxing retirement income other than Social Security, maybe expanding the sales tax to cover services. That's about $1.7 billion. And now I'm looking to you guys. Do I cut spending more to deal with that shortfall?
Well, or what is the shortfall? I mean,
in the next 6 months. In the next 6 months.
But so 6 months is not your problem, right? 6 months is
what
the
long term. Okay.
You have to be able to articulate what is it that the state's
going
to do
for the next
the next 5 years, right? What can we expect? How are you going to? What are you going to do with the unpaid bills? How much of the tax increase is going to bring down the unpaid bills? Are you going to have a reasonable spending cap?
You and John Tillman both took over my show. You're asking all the questions. They're good questions, but let me just try to hone it in because you're the guy who has to give the answers. I can't. Okay. So you said, what's the shortfall? Seems to me, if I'm Mr. Rauner, I say even taking a longer-term view, not necessarily 5 years. Once this, I'm doing with the full budget. I'm dealing with about a $4 billion shortfall, and you and I have just developed about $1.7 billion to deal with that. I need to find another $2 to $2.5 billion at least. Can I do that? Can you folks help me at the Civic Federation? Do I do a 5% across the board cut of spending? That gives me only $1.5 billion. Do I do a 10% across the board cut? Do I do something not across the board? Your turn. What's the answer?
The best thing to do is to look at program by program and evaluate where they fit in as a priority and where they fit in based on your available revenue. If you're not able in the time you have before you have to address your budget in February to look at programs specific and make some decisions about, even though this has been a good program, it's provided some benefit, it's not critical to what your goal is in the long term, so it's going to be below the line. It's not going to be funded.
So summarize that in 30 seconds. What are you telling me? I'm Mr.
Well,
Rauner. I don't quite understand.
You're going to have to do a combination of both. You're going to have to do some very painful things. You're going to have to cut spending dramatically, reduce borrowing significantly, and basically raise taxes. So what that means to the taxpayer and the citizens of Illinois, because we've dug such a deep hole, we're going to pay more in taxes, we're going to get less in government services, but the benefit could be that we stabilize the government so we can bring Illinois back economically so it becomes an attractive place for businesses and people to locate. Without that, we're not going to save the state pension systems. We're not going to basically be able to attract the people that we need to support the infrastructure we've already invested in. We need a long-term plan that balances the sacrifices.
And if I, Mr. Rauner, say to you, Mr. Msall, President of the Civic Federation, Governor Rauner, I don't want to raise the tax rate. I really don't. It's 3.75. I want to keep it there. Can I get away with that? Can I do this, do you think?
Depends what other things you're willing to do, right?
Tell me what else can I do?
We talked
Give me
about
some
the
options.
exemptions. Are you going to take care of all the? Are you going to
Okay,
eliminate
I'll
the
not- I'll
necessary
eliminate those
exemptions?
exemptions, okay.
Get rid of the retirement income.
Yeah.
Tax food and drugs.
I mean, I'll tax
basically.
retirement income,
Tax-
except for Social Security, okay?
Tax food and drugs. Get rid of the sales tax exemption on that. Allow for people at a low income.
Not food and
to
drugs,
basic-
but other than that, we'll
No.
tax-
You got to look at what. There's no reason why we should exempt your tax on food, right?
No? Really?
Right. You're
Okay.
well paid. You're living well in
Well,
the in the
what
northern
about some
suburbs.
people who are
But
low
poor
income?
people?
Yeah.
We can provide for them.
We can have
do.
those individual exemptions for the poor people, but
We
not
can
for the higher
have
income
basically
people.
the best way to do that is to make it income determinative of whether you get the exemption or not. If you're
So
below
you
a
walk
certain
in the
level,
store, you have something that says
you could either have a card
Yeah.
or you could run it as a what they call the circuit breaker, where people, when they file even the earned income tax credit,
get
when
a
they
break
file
then.
their taxes, they get a refund based on
Good
what
point.
their
I'm
tax
glad you
is.
called me. Mr. Rauner's now thanking you because that's a good point. Seriously, it is. Sort of a means-tested,
We can't
means-tested sales tax.
We cannot
a
continue to
means-tested
do
sales tax exemption.
exactly. We can't continue to do
Okay.
what we've been doing in the past and think we're going to get a different
Anything
result.
else? Now tell me. Have I done that? I've done all of what you just said in the last minute. Still seems like I'm maybe
Still, we're in for a
billion
very tough
and a half
place.
short. Where else do I cut? Any place you'd recommend?
You have to look at which programs are your priority. I'm not Bruce Rauner. I'm not the Illinois General Assembly.
Does the
That's what
Civic
they're elected.
Federation make any recommendations?
We make
on
lots
that?
of recommendations.
On the priorities. Do they make
No,
recommendations?
we don't set the
You don't do
priorities.
that.
We
Okay.
believe that there are some basic services that need to be provided for the health, welfare, and well-being of the citizens of Illinois. You have to maintain a certain criminal justice system. You have to maintain a certain transportation system. You have to maintain an
Defined
education
contributions.
system.
He likes Mr. Rauner. I like defined contribution plan. Can I go there? Will that help?
It could be part of the solution. It is not a panacea unto itself.
But it can be
because-
part.
Well, you have to also recognize that teachers and many government and municipal government employees do not receive Social Security. So you can't just say you're going to be in a defined benefit plan without providing more in terms of the security, or else they will automatically be pushed into the Social Security system, which means those local governments will then be incurring.
One last idea, and then we got to go. I, Governor Rauner, think we ought to test getting away with modifying some of these benefits. The Supreme Court tells me it's unconstitutional. I go back and say to the people, we have the responsibility, I have the responsibility to find a tax spending decision that works for all the people. So my executive order, taking a cue perhaps from the President, my executive order, Governor Rauner, I'm going to have to cut some of these benefits for teachers and other state employees right now because some of these people are making the median income in the city of Chicago for teachers is about $70,000. That's higher than most private citizens. Pensions, some people, their superintendents, from New Trier, getting a $232,000 a year pension payment. Now that's not most people. I, Governor Rauner, am going to work with the Civic Federation, the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club?
Correct.
Yeah. I'm going to work with all you folks to come up with something that's as close as we can to make it constitutional, but gives us some relief on the pension costs, which you have so ably described, are enormous. Mr. Rauner,
I don't understand what you're saying. We have a bill, right, that the Illinois General Assembly passed a year ago that did all those things, right? It made changes, made it more affordable, had considerable savings.
That
for
was
the state.
declared unconstitutional. So
No, it has not been declared
No, but it will.
unconstitutional. It's before the court.
It's before the court. It was declared in this show. In this show, we said hypothetically, it was my bet. I don't know if it's your bet. It's my bet that the Illinois Supreme Court will sustain the lower court and hold it unconstitutional. Assuming
and that's based
that
on
happens.
what legal analysis?
That's based on what?
What your legal analysis? Do you think that it's just because of circuit court? Basically, why do we have a elected Supreme Court except to rule on the constitutionality
I know the
of
Illinois
issues?
Supreme Court. I know they listen to certain constituencies, and I know they don't want to uphold. They don't want.
I don't have the
they don't want to
benefit of
uphold that
your
Constitution.
internal knowledge. I haven't talked to any members of the Supreme Court.
Would you,
State of
Mr.
Illinois
Rauner, if I offer you a job,
and
would
the
you
city
take
of
it?
Chicago. No, the Civic Federation is an independent, nonpartisan government research organization. In order to maintain what we do, we try to maintain our objectivity and push the whole state forward, not get involved in any particular administrative issue.
Thank you so much, Laurence.
Thank you
Msall.
already. Appreciate it. Thank you.